Okay, today's daf we're learning is Pesachim Daf Dalid. We are dedicating today's daf. Today's daf is sponsored in honor of Alana Storch. We're dedicating today's daf to our mom and Safta in honor of her birthday. We're so proud of her dedication to her Daf Yomi, even as she cares for her two young granddaughters full-time during COVID. We're grateful for the Jewish values that she taught us and continues to model for us. With love, Ruthie, Ira, Ruben, Juliana, Emmanuel, Ariane, Elia, and Elsa. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to start with the very top of the daf. We want to finish off this topic of language and the importance of how we choose our words and what words how we speak, how it reflects. And that's number one, how we should speak carefully for how it will affect others that we speak to. And we're going to see how it affects what people think of us. And particularly, we're going to see that we can get a sense of which tribe you're from based on how you speak. So there's a bit of two different aspects here. The first is try to speak in a way, and the way we saw yesterday, where he didn't want to tell people that the Rav Kahana it was Rav Kahana, I believe, had died. And yeah, it was Rav Kahana, that he didn't want to say right away, he's dead. Same way we're going to see another story with that here. And then we're going to see about the tribes and how if somebody speaks in a particular manner, that's indicative of who they are, or even if not even necessarily speaks, but deals with things in a particular way. In fact, it's not even going to be so much speech related, but it's about the idea that we can identify something about a person based on their actions. Okay, it's a little bit different than the other cases because you're going to see it's not even really speech related. Rav bar Chua de Rabbi Chia ubar achte. Okay, there's a nice little chart if you have the Koran about Rav's lineage. Okay, so I'll open it actually. It's a good chart. So it shows, I'll show it here in the picture. Sorry, try to get it. Okay, here's a little image of how everyone was related. Okay, so Rav Achav Kafri was the grandfather. He was the father of Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Abba, and as he was the grandfather of Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Abba had two wives. With one wife, he had a child named Ivu, who was the father of Rav. He had from a different wife, Rabbi Chia. Okay, so they were half brothers. And then Rabbi Chia had a sister from his mother's first marriage. In other words, there were two marriages from different sides. And her name was Ima. So Rabbi Chia had these two half siblings. One was Ima and one was Ivu. And the two of them got married. They weren't related to each other. Okay, they were only both related to Rabbi Chia. So because of that, they both had a child named Rav. So Rabbi Chia was Rav's uncle from his mother's side and from his father's side. Okay, that's the reka, the background to this story. So Rav was the nephew of Rabbi Chia, ubar achte, and that's bar Chua, the son of his brother and the son of his sister. Kisalik lahatam, when Rav went up to Israel. Now we always know Rav came to Babylonia, but he must have gone back and visited. So when he went to visit, Amarle, Rabbi Chia said to him, Ivu kayam, is my brother Ivu still alive? Amar le, so instead of responding, no, he responded, Ima kayemet, well, why don't you ask me about my mother? She's also your sister. Amar le, Ima kayemet. So he said, okay, is your mother alive, right? Ima. Amar le, and as my sister. Amar le, Ivu kayam, is Ivu alive? Amar le l'shame, so he immediately understood that the fact that he kept averting the question was because he was concerned, right? He didn't want to say that they had died. So he immediately says to his shamash, Chalotz li min alai, take off my shoes, v'holich kelai achalai lebeit hamerchatz, and then bring my clothes that I need for the beit hamerchatz to wash myself. Now this is strange. Isn't an avel forbidden to go to wash, especially in the bathhouse? So what we have here is something interesting. This is what we call a shmu'a rechoka. This is when you hear about someone who died a long time ago, not when, right, it's the first week of Shiva, or I think it's even within a month. But if you hear after a while after it happened, which is what happened, you heard that he was actually supposed to have sat Shiva. So there's certain things that you do and certain things that you don't do that are like Avelut. So we're now going to learn from the story three things. Shma mina tlat, this is classic, that the structure of bring a story and then say we can infer from here three things according to the halacha. Shma mina, right, we're now off topic. Okay, the whole reason we brought this was because of how he broke the news to his uncle that his siblings had died. Shma mina, avel asor b'nilat sandal. You see from here that in someone who's mourning can't wear regular shoes. They have to take their shoes off, right? Generally, we say you can't wear leather shoes. It's actually a little bit strange. We don't learn that from here. So why is it saying we learn that from here? So some people say, no, what they're trying to tell you is, you might have thought the laws for Shmuah Rechoka, when you hear long after the time it happened, maybe you don't have to take your shoes off. Maybe that doesn't apply. It does apply. Shmamina, Shmuah Rechoka ina noheget ele yom echad. You learn that it only holds for one day. That's why he said, bring me my clothes to go to the Beit HaMerchatz. And because Rabbi Chia was a very prominent rabbi, apparently the Mefarshim claim he did this to teach everyone the halacha. Maybe it's not so common that this would happen. So therefore, he wanted people to know that in the event this does happen, I want you to know that it's only one day, and that's why I'm getting my clothes ready for the Beit HaMerchatz, because I'm going to go shower after this. I'm going to basically have Avelut, and now we're going to see not even for a whole day. Ushmamina miktzad yom kekulo. Just like we hold in regular days of Avelut, okay, where, let's say, for example, you bury someone, as long as there's a little time that day to sit, that counts as your first day. And your last day counts as also, right? You shiva just in the morning, right? I was thinking about this with quarantine. Right now I'm quarantined, right? The question is, do you count? I'm trying to figure out, do you count miktzad yom kekulo? Does it work like that or not, right? What day counts for what? So you can imagine. So anyway, we're saying even with Shmuah Rechoka, we're going to say miktzad yom kekulo. So you really only sit shiva for a very short period of time. That's it. So we took off his shoes. And then now some people say, why didn't he tear kriya? Okay, so first of all, you could answer very simply. They wanted the shmami not slat structure. All the time they have these stories and they say, we learned 3 things. 3 is like a kind of number that's just a common number. And they wanted to pick 3 things. So they picked 3 things. They didn't talk about kriya. Maybe he really did tear kriya. Some people say, no, you don't tear kriya on Shmuah Rechoka. Some people say you do. It's just that this was for a sibling and only for a parent. And maybe there's a distinction between sibling and parent. So if you find out about a parent who died a long time later, you still would tear kriya, but not necessarily about a sibling. There's a lot of differences, la halacha, among the Mefarshim about how to derive for this story regarding kriya. Okay, that's our first story. Now we have 2 more stories. Like I said, these are a little bit different. Hahuda Amar Donu Dine. Okay, so here it actually, he does say, okay, here's someone who says, judge me in court. Okay, what this really means, or according to Rashi anyway, this is someone, if you look, it's much further down on the page in Rashi, Havaka Amar Donu Dine. Bechol davar masau matan shayalu im adam haya omer tamid bo ladin. Okay, he basically said every time he had some interaction with someone in a debate about some kind of monetary issue, he said, we're going to court to deal with this. Okay, so that kind of person, we can assume, okay, there was a person who did this, Amre, shmamina midan kaate, he must come from Shevet Dan, dichtiv, Dan yadin imo, Dan yadin amo, ke'echad shivtei Yisrael. Okay, one of the attributes of Dan was that he always went to court. Okay, he wanted to deal with things in court. So therefore, we can assume from this person's words, he must have been from Shevet Dan. Okay, that one does have to do with words. Actually, they both have to do with words, but it's interesting because it's more words that are reflective of their actions. There was a person who used to say, Achif yama asisne birata. Okay, Rashi brings 2 explanations. I'll go with the first one. It's someone who says, if I could build a palace, I'd build it on the beach, right? We all know these people who love to live on the beach, right? They love the beach. The beach is just a beautiful place, right? If I have my ideal place where I would live on the beach. So if somebody says this, but right, there was a person who said this, they checked into it and they said, oh, look, he's actually from Shevet Zvulun, which makes sense. It says about Zvulun that he will dwell by the water. So they say this person must be from Zvulun. I don't know if you want to check all the people you know who love to live on the beach, find out if they really came from Shevet Zvulun or not. Probably unlikely. But anyway, that's what they say here. So again, what you say, particularly about how you want to act, is reflective of who you are and where you came from. So this is a little bit different than what we saw yesterday. Okay, now we're going to finish up this whole sugya. V'hasha de kaimalan. So now going back, our whole question was or la arba'asa, right? So why does it say or? There's a lot of stuff written about this, by the way, and I also just want to promote some of the content on our site. There's been some interesting articles written by Shoshana Baker, by Gita Neufeld, some introductions to Pesachim, really relevant material that's good to read. So I recommend going to the site to see it. Later on the daf, I'll mention some others which relate to something we're going to learn later in the daf. But in any case, we're going to see now or ortahu. Now that we finally established that or la arba'asar means the night, michti bein Rabbi Yehuda bein Rabbi Meir, who we're going to see later today, both of them who disagree about when are you supposed to stop eating chametz on Erev Pesach, but they both agree that it's a no asor ela mishesh sharu lamala, that the real law is that it's forbidden from the middle of the day. In other words, each one says we're going to make it a little earlier for various reasons, but they both agree that from Torah law, you can't eat from 6 hours. And we're going to see the source for this later today. If that's the case, why don't we do bedika right before that? It would make the most sense. In fact, it's always interesting that we do bedika at night and we always still have that pile of chametz that you're saving for the morning. Seems strange, like you're doing bedika and yet you still have chametz in your house. The best and ideal time would be to do it right before you're forbidden to eat chametz. So why don't we do that? So why don't, let's look around at other halachot that we have, other, that comes up in other areas. There's this concept of zrizim makdim in the mitzvah. You're supposed to do things the earliest time possible. So what would you think the earliest time possible is? When the day starts. When does the day start? The halachic day starts at night. But no, if we're going to use the zrizim, whenever we say zrizim makdim in the mitzvah, we don't mean the night before. It always refers to the morning. And therefore, nivdok b'tzafra. Why don't we check in the morning, early in the morning? Okay, dichtiv. How do we know that zrizim makdim would be do it early in the morning and not the night before? Because it says ubayom hashmini mo basar or lato. Classic example of zrizim is brit milah. In fact, this is interesting because in Israel, the custom is many people do brit milah all times of day. But I remember growing up in Chutz La'aretz, everybody always did the brit milah in the morning. Nobody pushed it off till the afternoon, and that's based on zrizim makdim. Vitanya kol hayom kulo kasher the milah. Really, you could do a brit milah all day long, and that's what people do, in fact, do it all day long. But elash is zrizim makdim in the mitzvah, but it's better to do it first thing in the morning. Shenemar, where do we learn it from? Avram, when he went to the Akedah. Vayishkem Avraham baboker. He gets up early. That's what we learn from Avram. Best to do it first thing in the morning. So if that's the case, we should do bedika. Forget it. You don't want to do it right at Sheish. Do it first thing in the morning. Why do we do it at night? So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. First, I just want to point out, we're going to see Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak a number of times in today's daf. Sometimes we don't always pay attention to names, so I'm kind of putting it out there for you. So now it says, what's his reason? Well, number one, it's a time when most people are in their houses, right? Try the morning. Now it's interesting. So first of all, this explains why we're not doing it at 6 hours into the day. Everybody's at work, right? People aren't home then. Even though we're going to learn that there was an Isra Malacha on Erev Pesach, but still it's not the ideal time because it's not the time people are always in their houses. Even in the morning, if you say people are in their houses early in the morning, but what's the issue? The issue is that you might be in your house, but you're rushing to get out to work. And additionally, if that wasn't enough, the light of the candle is good for doing b'dikat chametz, meaning, okay, this is actually strange because you might think daylight would be a much better way. In those days when it was pitch black at night, all you have is a candle. But they say the candles are good for getting into nooks and crannies and seeing things where there might be a shadow and it's hard to see with the sunlight. So therefore, it's better to use a candle, and therefore we're going to do it at night. Okay, it's still a little problematic because still it seems like using a light would be better. And I know we're always walking around the house with our candle, and you think if we just had the lights on, we'd be able to see a lot better. But anyway, that's the explanation given. It's interesting to me, maybe because Hanukkah is coming up, these two concepts seem very similar to Hanukkah, right? We do it when people are coming home from work, so there's the most people around, and it's using candlelight. So it's an interesting connection. Okay, moving on. So now we've established that's why we do bedika at night. So first it was all to establish that we do it at night, and now we explain why we do it at night. Am Rabbi, Hilka, Hait Sorva Merabanan, Lo Liftach Beidne Beorta des Tlesar Denage Arbasa. It says, therefore, a Talmid Chacham, someone who's learning, shouldn't start learning at the night of the 13th, in other words, the end of the 13th day, going into the 14th at night. You shouldn't start learning. Dilma mashchale shmate va'atelim nuemi mitzvah. We're worried that people might forget. You might get carried away by your learning. This comes up in all sorts of places. One of them is you shouldn't start learning something in depth before davening. That's where it says you should only learn a halacha psuka. We learned that in brachot. You should learn something that there's no debate about, because if you start getting into something there's a debate about, you'll get carried away by your learning and you'll forget to daven. Likewise, they say, since you're supposed to do it, and this goes back to what I said yesterday, the Rabbit says you should do it when it's still kind of light out. In other words, before it gets too dark. So therefore, don't start doing something you're going to get carried away with, and you might forget to do Badika. So therefore, do your Badika early, right? This is the reason to try to do Badika as early as possible so that you don't forget. And here, by the way, it mentions that it's a mitzvah. Okay, in case you thought it was just preparation, it wasn't a mitzvah, it describes it here exactly as a mitzvah, and we're going to see that later today also. Now they're going to ask this very classic question when it comes to B'dika Chametz. So they asked Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak the following question: Hamaskir bayit lechavero ba'arba'asa al mi livdok. If you rent your house to someone on the 14th, who has to do B'dika? This is very often the case. Somebody goes to a hotel, somebody goes to rent, right? A lot of people go away for Pesach. If you go on the 14th, are you obligated in B'dika? What if you go on the 13th, right? Do you have to do B'dika in your room? Do you have to do B'dika? Let's say you rent an Airbnb or something. Do you have to do a B'dika there? So we're now, and who's responsible? Is it you or is it the person who you rented it from? Al hamaskir livdok. So here are the two sides. Do we say the person who's renting it's supposed to do the check? Dechamira didehu. Now, if I move in on the 14th, I didn't bring any, assuming I came there Erev Pesach, I'm certainly not bringing chametz with me. So what am I checking for? Am I checking for chametz that might have been there from before? Well, that's not my chametz, it's the owner's chametz. So maybe he's supposed to check. O dilma ala socher livdok di isura b'reshutekai. But in the end, I own this right now. Right now, it's mine. So if that's the case, if I'm to find chametz here, in the end, it's going to be mine. Well, it's true. It maybe wasn't mine to begin with, but now I live here. It's in my reshut. It's in my domain. So maybe I have to check. So let's see. Tashma. Tashma means come and learn. We're going to take some other source and use it to answer a question. Hamaskir bayit lechavero ala socher lasot lo mezuzah. If you rent a house from someone, who's supposed to put a mezuzah up? It's the person who rents, their responsibility. So they say, right, but that's not necessarily the same. Because Hatam Hama Rav Masharshia, specifically Rav Masharshia said there, mezuzah chovat hadarhi. So the mezuzah is the obligation of the one who's actually physically living there. But that might not be the same as chametz. So hachamai, but what's the case by us? Amarlu Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. So here it comes to answer the question they asked for. They asked him. So what they say? What did he say? Tanina. Let's learn it from the following source. Hamaskir bayit lechavero. Here it's going to say it explicitly. Okay, so Naji asked me a question. I'm going to bring you a Tanaitic source. Im ad shalom asar lo maftechot chal arba'asar ala maskir livdok. If he hasn't yet handed over the keys, when the 14th, the night of the 14th kicks in other words, it's all about, it doesn't matter who, it's about the timing. If you haven't received the keys yet on the eve of the 14th, when you're obligated in B'dika, ala maskir livdok, then the person who owns it is supposed to check. But if you already received the keys when the 14th kicks in, ala socher livdok. So it all depends. So this is good. If you take an Airbnb and you go the night before and you're there when B'dika Chametz kicks in, you have to do B'dikat Chametz. If you go there on the 14th in the morning, then you're not obligated to do B'dika. But now comes a new question. So they ask him another question. Hamaskir bayit lechavero ba'arba'asar. Okay, so I come into my Airbnb on the 14th. Chezkato baduk or en chezkato baduk? Can I assume that the owner did b'dikat chametz or not? Okay, and am I allowed to make an assumption about it? Now, this obviously would mean if your owner's Jewish. On the other hand, if you go into an Airbnb or some other rental or a hotel, you also know that there's an assumption that they cleaned the place very well because that's just what they do when you go into somewhere. So can you assume that it was checked or not? Here we seem to be talking about, can you assume that halachically somebody did a b'dika, right, when the owner was Jewish? Limay nafkamina. So they say, why? This is such an irrelevant question. Lishayle, just ask. In other words, why are we asking about assumptions when you could just ask the owner, did you do b'dika, did you not? And then you'd know. If you didn't do b'dika, then you would have to do b'dika yourself. So they say, no, we're talking about the leita lahai de l'shiule. We're talking about a case where he's not around. Okay, so let's say you get into your Airbnb, they leave you the keys. Usually the owner's not there. And you can't, you email them to find out and they don't answer you. So now you're stuck. Okay, and in those days, you can imagine it was more of an issue. So if the person's not around to ask, now the question is, do you have to bother yourself to go out of your way to do b'dikat chametz? It's interesting that they seem to say that b'dikat chametz is a tircha, is a big hassle, okay, which we're going to see also later. It's going to come up that it's a big hassle to do it. Now, different people do b'dika in a different way, right? Some people do it very superficially. They put out some 10 squares and they just kind of, collect the 10 squares and we're done and, do the b'dika kind of in the main area. But other people, the real idea is that you're supposed to really check your house well. Okay, now often we don't do a super duper b'dika because we've been spending weeks, depending on how crazy you are about Pesach, cleaning your house. So you already kind of know that there's no chametz in all those places. But it seems here like maybe you're talking where they didn't do serious spring cleaning and they want to really check around to see whether, to really check well. So now, and then it would be a big pain in the neck to start checking the entire house. Amar, and also, by the way, here there would be more of a reason to check because if you don't know that they checked, then really there might be chametz somewhere. So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Tani Tua. By the way, it reminds me of this great story my brother had in his shul. I just cannot mention this. One year, the drasha for Shabbat Gadol went on extra long, and it was between Mincha Maariv, and they missed Sudash Lishit, and they had a whole Sudash Lishit meal set out on Erev, Shabbat before Pesach, and they come to shul the next week, and this is a true story, and they open the door to wherever the room is where the Sudash Lishit was, and they find this whole chametz meal of Sudash Lishit. They just totally forgot, and they didn't check. So that's why you can see why B'dika would be important. It's a great story. Anyway, Amar Lehu Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Tani Tua. Let's learn it from here. And now we're going to bring the source, which is a little bit troublesome for many reasons. I'm going to get into the questions, though, only later when we get to the end of the sugya. Hakol ne'emanim al bior chametz, afilu nashim, afilu avadim, afilu ktanim. So remember our question. Our question is, can we assume that the owner did b'dika? Okay, if I walk into a house, I don't know if they did or not. It's now the 14th, the time for b'dika chametz passed already. And can I assume it was done? So they say, well, it says here that all people are believed, are trusted. Now, we're talking about people that generally their testimony is not trustworthy in a court. Okay, this is a whole big question, why women's testimony isn't trustworthy in a court. I think it has to be understood with the understanding of how women were perceived in those days and how they weren't involved in business dealings and they were mainly in the house and they weren't so educated. And maybe because of that, they didn't want to accept their testimony in court. So women who normally their testimony isn't accepted, or avadim, which are Canaanite slaves who are pseudo-Jews, right? They do a brit milah and they're part of your household, but they're not fully Jewish. Or afilu ktanim, or minors who generally we say don't have da'at, they don't have enough knowledge, therefore they're not accepted their testimony. Yet all these people are believed to say we got rid of our chametz. Okay, and presumably getting rid of our chametz connects with also b'dikat chametz. So my time amehemne, why are they believed? Lav mishum dechezkato baduk. Wouldn't it be because we believe them? Why do we believe them? Because we assume anyway that things were checked. Okay, so therefore we'll believe someone who says, even if they're a woman, yes, we can check. So now we're going to say, no, that's not right. Now they're going to say dekasaval. The reason must be because they hold hakol chaverim hem etzel b'dikat chametz. Ditanya chaver shemet v'niach megura malea perot afilu hem b'nei yoman harehem b'chezkat metukanim. So now we're going to learn a few things. There's something called chaverim versus ama'aretz. Okay, chaver is someone. It's kind of like you're part of a society. Okay, these are people who are careful about particular mitzvot. For example, taking trumot and masrot, tithing their produce, which amei haaretz were not trusted about the maaser, more about the truma, yes, but not the maaser, and which went to the Levites. And also, particularly in those days, the chaverim kept themselves with tuma, in terms of tuma and tahara, they were very careful about, they ate all their stuff as if they were kohanim and had to keep laws of purity and impurity. So because of that, if people kept this high level of purity and impurity, they needed to trust other people who did the same. So those people are called chaverim. We can know if you're a chaver, which generally included any Talmid Chacham as a chaver, although you don't have to be a Talmid Chacham to be a chaver. You could also just be someone who's careful about halacha. So those people are known to be trustworthy. What they're saying here is we believe women and children and slaves. Why? Because everyone is chaverim etzel b'dikat chametz. The assumption is This is a mitzvah that everybody keeps. Even Rashi says, afilu ama aretz. Okay? And now Rashi adds, if you look at the first line in Rashi, Akol chaverim etzel b'dika, he says, afilu ama aretz, even a person who maybe isn't careful about other things is careful. We all know that there's people who don't care about certain things, but they're very careful about particular things. So b'dika, everyone did in those days. U'b'davar shu muchzak chaver, if you're muchzak a chaver for something, this is another jump you have to make. The assumption is, if the time for it came, then you did it in the right time. Not only are you going to do it, but you're going to do it in the right time. So that means if I go into a house on the 14th in the morning, and now they're going to say here, the reason why we believe women, children, and slaves about this is because we assume everybody's doing B'dika, and therefore we'll believe them. This is an assumption. They're going to reject this assumption because it doesn't really make so much sense. First of all, why do you need them to say it if it's obvious that we assume people do it anyway? So anyway, they use the proof of the chaver shemet. If somebody dies and there was a thing full of fruits there, even if they were just brought in the house that day, one can assume, now this is assuming the person who died was clear-headed before they died and wasn't sick in bed and not functioning, but you can assume that they took care of their fruits, and you can assume that they took the trumot masrot, and therefore you can eat them. So that's just a proof that people do things in the appropriate time. If they're believed, then we believe they do it in the right, in the time they're supposed to. But now they say, wait a minute, maybe we only believe them because they said so, right? Doesn't necessarily teach cheskato baduk, right? And this is what you're probably thinking in the first place. Here's a case where people said we did bedika. That's why they're believed, not because we assume that everybody does bedika. But now they say no. Atu amira dahani midi mashasha ipe. Here's a very strong line, which is going to lead to our question later. But any statement these people say is basically insignificant because we already say we don't trust these people in general. Right? If for testimony in court. So if their testimony in court isn't acceptable, then their statement here shouldn't be acceptable. So it doesn't necessarily prove anything. So therefore they say, elamai de chezkato baduk. So now they want to say, in other words, they try to say, maybe it doesn't prove chezkato baduk because here's a case where they actually said something. But now they say, no, they're saying something really isn't significant. So it must be chezkato baduk, and that's why you can trust them. So they say, wait a minute. But then that makes no sense. Elamai de chezkato baduk. So you're assuming right now that we can assume that it was checked. If so, then it shouldn't say, hi, hakol ne'emanim. It shouldn't say everyone's believed when it comes to saying they did bedika. It should say, very obviously, and this is what you're probably thinking, these two things are very different. It should have said, it should have said any house is under the presumption that it was checked, which means you can't learn from this source that we can assume it was checked. Because again, it says, if these people say it was checked, but that's not what we're saying. It's presumed checked even if nobody says anything. So now they say, wait, elamai. So now we're back to, okay, it must be, it's because they said something. Elamai, mishum amira dahane, which would then imply what? Ha lo amre hane, lo. But now we're going to say it must prove the opposite. If it's only because they said something, they're believed, it sounds like if they didn't say anything, we would assume that they didn't do bedika. And therefore, tifsho mina, we can infer from this the exact opposite that we thought in the beginning. De'en cheskato baduk. You can prove it's clear that we don't have a presumption that bedika was done, because if we did, you wouldn't need them to come saying anything. It would be believed without them saying anything. So now they say, okay, so let's go back. Lo olam emelcha cheskato baduk. It really must be that we can assume there's a presumption that they did bedika. So then you have to explain, hacha b'mayaskina, what's the case here? Now, we can always work on these chazakot. Chazakot come up all over in the Gemara. It means there's a certain assumption about human behavior. We can assume people will behave in a particular way, unless we know that it's not the case. If we know for sure they didn't check, then we can't use a presumption of what was done. So it must be de muchzaman de lo badak. We know that the person didn't check. This must be a case where it's assumed the person didn't check. The ka'amrahane badkine. And these people come along to say, we checked it. Okay? We know it was checked because we checked it. We know the owner didn't do it, but we did it. Okay? Or the male owner didn't do it. So now, what's the chidush? What's the unique halacha here? Ma'u detem alo lehimnuhu Rabbanan. Maybe we wouldn't believe these people. Kamash malan kevan de b'dikat chametz midirabanan hu. Since b'dikat chametz is only rabbinic in nature, this is going to be a big line. I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent on this because there's a lot of interesting things in this line. And I won't be able to do it full justice, but we'll try a little bit. Since chametz is derabanan, why is it only derabanan? Because you have to get rid of your chametz. So isn't b'dika part of that, right, by Torah law? Well, mid'oraita bebito ba'al masagela. From Torah law, it's enough just to nullify it in words. Therefore, heimnu rabbanan b'derabanan. Since it's only derabanan, the rabbis allowed people who we don't necessarily believe in other cases to be believed here. Okay, there's a few big questions here that come up. The first one is the topic of Gefer for this week of Rabbanit Chana Dreyfus. She talks about a very famous machloket Rashi Tosfot here and goes in depth. I'll mention it briefly. If you can listen to their Shiur, I recommend it. Rashi says here, Babitul Ba'alma. Okay, we're right around the same area where we are in the Gemara in the Rashi lines. Dichtiv. Where do we get that bitul is halacha mid'oraita, Torah law? It says tashbitu. It says you should get rid of se'or mibatechem, your leavening agents from your house. V'lo ktiv tiva'aru. What does tashbitu mean? Tashbitu, according to Rashi, means nullify it. It doesn't mean destroy it, which you might have thought, because if it meant destroy, it would have said tiva'aru. So tashbitu, they say hashbata belev hi hashbata. They say getting rid of it in your heart, meaning saying I'm nullifying it, is mid'oraita. And for Rashi, and this goes against what I mentioned that Safrai says in the beginning, that bitul was all this idea the rabbis came up with in the time of the Gemara. According to Rashi, it's by Torah law bitul. Okay, the idea of bitul is a special, unique halacha by chametz that you can nullify it in your heart. And that's when we say it's ka'afra da'ara. If you remember, when we say bitul, we say it's like the dust of the earth. It's this unique halacha that you can basically do what we call hashbata belev and make it as if it's not there. Okay, that's Rashi. Tosfot says, what are you talking about? Tashbitu, okay, if you look at Tosfot, on the fourth line, it says, V'kasheleri, Tahai hashbata havarihi. He says, what are you talking about? Getting rid of chametz? They're obviously talking about burning the chametz. They're not talking about getting rid of it in your heart. And what he basically claims, and this is what Safrai goes with, is that the bitul that we're talking about is mid'oraita, is learned out from other halachot, from laws of hefker. The idea that you can nullify and say, all of my possessions are no longer mine. Okay, we've seen this a number of times, that someone could basically, remember there was some time we were talking about rich people and poor people, and a rich person could turn himself into a poor person in a second, because he could just say, all of my stuff is up for grabs. Anyone who wants to take it can take it, and he can immediately become a poor person. Okay, so there were all sorts of halachic things that relating to that. But anyway, the idea being that there's this concept of hefker, and that's what Safrai says was really developed in the time of the Amoraim, this idea. And therefore, since there's this concept of hefker, so you can apply that to our situation. And therefore, bitul, it's not that there's a halacha of bitul on Pesach, but on a Torah level. It's that there's a concept of hefker in general, which bitul works to basically say, I'm nullifying my stuff, which then basically is different than Rashi. Rashi's saying it doesn't exist at all. It's like dust of the earth. According to Tosfot, it's just saying it's not mine. Remember I said the other day that you could be walking on the street. It says, Bal Yera'eh, Bal Yimatzeh. You can't see, you can't find chametz. I can see chametz that's not mine. It's not forbidden. So if I have chametz in my house that I nullified and I basically said, this is hefker, it means it's not mine anymore. It's still there. It's just not mine. So there's a lot of difference between Rashi, Tosfot. Rabbanit Chana talks about it in her Shiur, recommended listening. Okay, so that's one issue. The second issue, which is even maybe more interesting or just as interesting, is the second line, which is, according to the Gemara, the conclusion is, and this goes back to the women's issue, and it's not just interesting because we're women, but it's interesting in general about women's testimony. So it says here, the assumption of the Gemara right now is, since it's d'Rabbanan, we believe women. If it were d'Oraita, we wouldn't believe them. Now, this is a very complicated line. Forget about complicated in a sense of why aren't women believed. But let's assume you don't accept testimony of women in court. Now, first of all, there are exceptions to the rule. For example, if it's an aguna case, if we want to testify that someone died and the woman, there's only women who know that the person died, we accept a woman's testimony for this. We also accept one witness for this. Anyway, things like that. Now, what if The problem is, and Tosfot brings this up, if you look at the next Tosfot, who knew Rabbanan b'Dirabanan, Tosfot says, Afagav dekol davar shehu biyadam mehemnina le l'nashim v'avadim. Says, wait a minute, this contradicts other sugyot that we've learned. There's a concept of eid echad ne'eman b'isurin. If you go to your friend's house and your friend says, I keep kosher, okay, how do you know if you can believe them or not, right? So the assumption is, if they're a person who abides by, their shomer Shabbat and certain things, then we can assume that they're a believable person. Then we can believe them that even though normally you need 2 witnesses, 1 witness is acceptable. Likewise, we accept women's testimony when it comes to isurim. Okay, so we're going to see. We believe women and also slaves, Canaanite slaves. We believe them even in Torah law. Filu b'doraita. Masim b'chol yom. He says this is masim b'chol yom. Every day we come up with situations like this. She'anu ma'aminim le'isha ve'eved ala shchita va'ala nikul. And all sorts of things about maser. We believe women about these things. So why all of a sudden is the Gemara not believing women? They do believe women when it comes to bedika chametz, but only because it's derabanan. But if it were doraita, we wouldn't believe women. That seems to go against other basic sugyot where we actually do believe women when it comes to these things. If a woman says, I keep kosher, we believe her. So what's going on here? So Tosfot gives some explanations. I'll give you a few other answers that people give. It's a very good question, okay? Tosfot says, and here we go back. I told you we get back to this. He says, because it's a tircha yetera, it's a very big deal to do bedika. Maybe the women, and he quotes the Yerushalmi, you won't like this line, shemefarish mipnei shanashim atzlaniot. We actually saw this Tosfot before when we talked about tchumin and women. So, and he even makes reference to tchumin and all that. But anyway, it says it's a tircha yetera v'tzarich dikduk gadol. And it needs a lot of detail-oriented focus. And maybe the women don't want to deal with that. So maybe they're just saying, oh yeah, we did bedika just to be done with it, okay? So that's why only because it's derabanan do we allow it. If it were doraita, we wouldn't. So it's right, it's counterintuitive because in the end we do believe them. But if it were doraita, we wouldn't necessarily believe them because of the big effort that it entails. And maybe women are going to be lazy. It's very strange they call women lazy because women in those days, I definitely don't think they were lazy. But anyway, that's Tosfot's answer. As many of these questions, the question is much better than the answers. The Etor claims that maybe it's only relating to a katan, and a woman would have been believed anyway, but the minor wouldn't have been believed. The Raavad says maybe it's because it's about something someone else did, and maybe also because this is a case where we say huchzak b'isul. It's as opposed to, let's say, Trumot Masra, where people take them and whatever. But here, chametz is allowed all year, and therefore there's more likelihood that you're going to have chametz in your house because it's allowed all year, and therefore at this point we're going to assume you must have chametz, and therefore we're going to be more stringent about this. Anyway, different answers given, but the question is a really important question. Okay, moving on, ibayalihu, back to our rental. So now we're going to say hamaskir bayat lechavero bechezkat baduk. So now we assume that it is okay if you rent someone a house and we assume it was bechezkat baduk. So again, we resolved the last question and we said we assume that if you move in somewhere on the 14th after the night passed, we assume that they checked into bedika. But now we're going to say, what if you rent a house from someone assuming it was checked, and you get there and you find tons of chametz in the house and they clearly didn't check it. Mahu. What's the situation? Can you go back to the person? You rent this Airbnb Erev Pesach. It's full of chametz and you don't have enough time to get rid of it before. So you go back to the owner and you say, hey, listen, I rented this assuming you checked it. I want my money back. Do they have to give you your money back? Do we say that this was a mistaken transaction because I assumed you were giving me a house that had no chametz in it and you gave me a house full of chametz? So let's see what they say. Tashma, let's learn it from here. De'amar Abaye, Abaye says, Lo mebaya ba'atra de lo yave agra ubadku, de'nichalel inish l'kiyumei mitzvah begufe. You don't have to ask the question in a place where nobody hires someone to do bedika chametz for them, right? This is interesting. It seems like it splits into places where people hired someone to do bedika for them and didn't hire. So if it's a place where you don't hire people, obviously you'd rather do the bedika yourself because everybody likes to do a mitzvah. Again, we see this issue, the bedika is a mitzvah. You want to get reward for doing a mitzvah. So you're kind of happy they didn't. Now again, if your house is really full of chametz and they didn't check and it's full, maybe not so much. And let's say you get it just before the time. But let's say you get it in the morning, there's a little bit of chametz around, you're happy to do an extra mitzvah. So if that's the case, and therefore we assume if you claim, I want my money back, right? There's all sorts of reasons. You could go into an Airbnb and want your money back. You could say you don't like the apartment. It's not to your liking. But in other words, it's all a matter of, does it come into the category of mekach ta'ud or not? You knew what you were getting into. The fact that you don't like it is your tough luck. You saw the pictures. You should have paid better attention and, not realized. So we assume you're just making up stories because everybody likes to do a mitzvah themselves. But Abai says, and even even places where they hire someone to do bedika for them, because even people, there's an assumption that people like to even spend their money on mitzvot. People like that. They like to spend their money on mitzvot. This is assuming it's not too much money. It's not so much money to hire someone to do your bedika. So even then, we're going to assume you're happier to do the mitzvah. And therefore, if you rent it and it wasn't checked, just do the bedika yourself. You can't start claiming, oh, I want my money back. We assume if someone does that, they're just saying it because they really want their money back for some other reason, but it's not really a mekach ta'ud. There's a whole debate among the commentaries whether this is in a case where you didn't stipulate anything with the owner, or is this even in a case where he stipulated in the contract, I checked for, I promised to commit to check for chametz and he didn't. Is that reason for reneging or not? Okay, there's a debate whether that includes this case or not. Okay, now we're moving on to the last sugya for today about the times for eating chametz. It's not so clear how we segue into this. Just put it out there. Tanan hatam. We now quote a Mishnah. Rabbi Meir Omer, ochlim kol chamesh v'sorfim b'tchilat shesh. You eat chametz. You can eat all of the 5th hour, and you burn it at the beginning of the 6th, which basically means at 11 o'clock in the morning, right before the 6th hour comes in. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ochlim kol arba v'tolim kol chamesh. You eat all 4. It's to the end of the 4th hour. You wait the whole 5th, meaning you don't have to burn it yet, but you also can't eat. V'sorfim b'tchilat shesh, and you burn it at the beginning of the 6th. But now they comment. Everybody agrees the chametz from 6 hours into the day and more, meaning at midday, okay, 12 o'clock noon, is asur. Minalan. They all agree that that's forbidden by Torah law. Where did they get this from? Amar Abaye, Trey, Krai, Ktiv. There's 2 psukim. It says, Ktiv, Shivat Yamim Seor Lo Yimatzeh Bebatechem. 7 days you can't have seor. Okay, this is a whole other interesting topic. What is seor? Seor is like a leavening agent. Okay, there's different ways people make bread. Right, there's sourdough bread, which is the seor. It's there's machmetzet. It's this leavening agent, which is right. If you know sourdough bread, I have a nephew who was living with me during the seger in the beginning of the closure of Corona, and he got into making sourdough bread. And I finally learned firsthand how it's done and how basically you have to keep feeding it. And it gets better over time, and people would leave it forever, right? It would be this, instead of just leaving the dough for a long time to rise, if you use this leavening agent, it makes things work quicker and you leave it for a long time. So there were 2 interesting articles I read. One is Shuli Mishkin wrote on the Hadran site, and one is an article by Moshe Benovitz about this, why you have to get rid of leavening agents. And they both really talk about this idea that it's a bit of like starting fresh, right? This is something people kept for a long time, and getting rid of this leavening agent, right? People feed it all the time and from day to day, and it lasts for a really long time, and it gets better with time. The idea here is kind of having like a new start, okay? And Moshe Benovitz says very interestingly that the idea of 7 days makes perfect sense because it takes 7 days for it to get started. So it's almost like you're saying a whole new, right? You have to stop and then get started from scratch. Shuli Mishkin claims that it was an Egyptian. The whole idea of making sourdough bread was an Egyptian. They came up with the idea. They initiated this idea, and it's making a break from the Egyptian way of life. And it connects with the concept of Pesach. Very interesting. I never heard that before. Anyway, there's a lot out there about it, but we're going to just finish up now. So it says, 7 days you can't find seor in your houses. Uchtiv. And it also says, Ach bayom harishon tashbitu seor mebatechem. And on the first day, you should get rid of seor from your houses. So haketzad. How do you do this? In other words, if you can't have it in your house for 7 days and you're supposed to get rid of it on the first day, it makes no sense. If it can't be in your house, well, then you can't get rid of it. So what do they say? Lirabot arba'asar lebiur. They say that ach bayom harishon must be talking about the first day, meaning the day before Pesach on the 14th. And from there they get that you have to do it in midday of the day before. So now they say, why midday? Ema lirabot lele chamishasar lebiur. Maybe it's not midday of the 14th. Maybe it means the night of the 15th, the first night of Pesach. You have to. Yamim in leilot lo. It says Shivat Yamim, 7 days, or lo yimatzeh, days. Maybe it means you can't have it for 7 days, meaning during the day of this first day. So therefore, the chiyuv of tashbitu maybe kicks in the night, at the beginning of the night. And maybe it's telling you, get rid of it at the beginning of the night, and then, from there, have your 7 days. Kamash malan afilu leilot, right? Maybe it's coming to say that even at night, you can get rid of the chametz. Okay, maybe that's the whole idea of Ach B'Yom HaRishon. So we're kind of leaving you hanging, but we'll get back to this tomorrow and figure out how they prove that it definitely means on the 14th of the day. Okay, we will stop here for today, and have a good day, everybody.